History does not begin with a promise. It begins with a corpse. It hangs from the walls of Norwich, a rotting effigy for the crows, a warning carved in flesh and bone that hope will always end on a rope. And the name attached to that rotting meat, Robert Kett, became a curse. What then was his crime? He sought no crown, nor did he sell his country to a foreign power. His alleged crime seems primarily to have been his decision as a landowner to side with the grievances of the common people. His actions suggest a man who chose to stand with the destitute. He risked everything, not for personal gain, but for a simple radical ideal, that all men deserve justice. So how is it that a saint for the oppressed is crucified by the state, only to be buried in a tomb of silence for centuries? To understand the fire that swept through Norfolk in the summer of 1549, you have to understand the kindling that had been piling up for decades. England was a nation in the grip of a profound and painful transformation. The old world was dying, and the new one was being born in blood and confusion. The great Tudor monarch, Henry VIII, was gone, leaving behind a kingdom wrestling with the ghosts he had raised. His son Edward VI was just a boy, a pawn in a game played by ambitious men. The real power lay with a council of nobles, chief among them the Lord Protector, Edward Seymour, the Duke of Somerset. Somerset was a complex figure, a man who styled himself as a friend to the common people, a good duke who seemed genuinely concerned by the rising tide of poverty and injustice. But his good intentions were adrift in a sea of economic chaos. The single greatest source of this chaos was the land itself. For centuries, the English countryside had been a patchwork of open fields and common lands. These commons were the lifeblood of village communities. They were where a peasant could graze his cow, forage for firewood, or hunt for rabbits to feed his family. It wasn't ownership, but it was a right, an ancient custom that allowed the poorest to survive. But a new kind of thinking was taking hold among the landed gentry. Wool was becoming immensely profitable, fueling a booming textile trade with the continent. And a single shepherd could manage a flock of sheep that generated far more profit than a dozen tenant farmers. So the landlords began to enclose the common land. They put up hedges and fences, tore down cottages, and turned entire villages into vast empty sheep runs. For the landowners, it was a logical business decision. For the people who lived on that land, it was a death sentence. They were driven from their homes, their ancient rights erased, with nowhere to go and no way to feed their children. This process, known as enclosure, was the cancer eating away at the heart of rural England. Compounding this misery was a religious revolution. Henry VIII had broken with the Catholic Church in Rome, and under his son Edward, England was lurching towards a more radical Protestantism. The monasteries, which had once provided charity, education, and health care for the poor, had been dissolved, their lands sold off to the gentry, who were now enclosing them. In 1549, a new Book of Common Prayer was introduced, replacing the familiar Latin Mass with services in English. For many, this was not just a change in worship. It was an attack on the sacred traditions that had guided their lives for generations. In the west of England, this very prayer book would spark its own bloody rebellion. And beneath it all, the economy was failing. The government, desperate for cash to fund foreign wars, had been debasing the currency, mixing silver coins with cheaper metals. The result was rampant inflation. Prices for food and basic goods skyrocketed, while wages stagnated. A family's savings could become worthless in a matter of months. People were hungry, dispossessed, and desperate. They saw wealthy landowners, men who were once their neighbors, growing fat on their misery. They petitioned the government. They pleaded with local magistrates, but they were ignored. The Duke of Somerset made sympathetic noises, even setting up commissions to investigate illegal enclosures. But these were toothless and easily thwarted by the powerful local gentry who had no intention of giving up their newfound wealth. The air was thick with resentment. All it would take was a single spark to set the whole country ablaze. And that spark was about to be struck in a small Norfolk town called Wymondham. Robert Kett was not a man born to lead a revolution. He was, by the standards of his day, a pillar of his community, a solid, respectable member of the yeoman class. This group sat in the middle rank of English society, below the gentry but well above the landless laborers and impoverished peasants. Gerstacker was CEO during the 1960s, the man at the helm when the napalm contracts were signed and the student protests exploded. He was the one who had to answer for the napalm girl. He became, for a generation of anti-war protesters, the human face of the merchants of death. Gerstacker was not a reclusive figure. He was a proud public-facing CEO, and as a result, he became a personal target. He wasn't just protested, he was hunted. As documented in PBS's American Experience in 1968, Gerstacker, a proud alumnus of the University of Michigan, was on a college campus to give a speech. He was met by a mob of students. They didn't just shout slogans, they pelted him with paint bombs and physically chased him off the campus. He was, in his own words, shaken. He was a pillar of the American establishment, and he was being treated like a criminal. This personal, visceral rejection by the very generation he was trying to recruit was a profound blow, one that was reportedly instrumental in the 1969 decision to finally drop the napalm contract. This relentless pressure had a profound long-term effect on the corporation. The company's name, Dow, was now toxic. It was a liability. This led to a series of internal disputes and ultimately a strategic dissolution of the very identity the Dow family had built. The first crack came from within. The 1984 Agent Orange settlement, which the company had celebrated as a legal victory, was a disaster for its shareholders. In the wake of the settlement, a shareholder lawsuit was filed, as documented by corpresearch.org, accusing the company's management of breaching their fiduciary duty. The shareholders argued that management knew about the dioxin risks and had hidden them, not just from the government, but from their own investors. This reckless, immoral decision had now exposed the company to billions in liability, tanked the stock price, and permanently damaged the brand. Dow, to avoid another public trial, quietly settled this shareholder suit for $10 million. The company was now paying fines for its own cover-up. But the real threat came from a new generation of investors. By the 2000s, the conglomerate model that Dow had perfected was out of fashion. Wall Street no longer wanted a single massive company that did everything. They wanted specialized, lean companies. And they saw Dow, with its massive, complex portfolio of plastics, agricultural chemicals, and industrial products, as a fat, slow-moving target. In 2014, a new kind of enemy appeared, the activist investor. A hedge fund named Third Point, run by the notoriously aggressive billionaire Daniel Loeb, took a massive stake in Dow. Loeb's argument was simple. Dow's leadership was incompetent. The company's stock was underperforming, and the only way to unlock value was to do what Dow's own internal logic had always resisted: break the company into pieces. This was a personal tragedy for the Dow corporate identity. Third Point demanded that Dow spin off its profitable plastics and petrochemical divisions from its slower agricultural division. This was a war for the soul of the company. Dow's management, led by CEO Andrew Leveris, fought back, but the pressure was too intense. This investor pressure forced Dow into the most dramatic move in its history. To survive, they had to merge. In 2017, in a $130 billion merger of equals, Dow Chemical merged with its oldest and largest rival, DuPont. The new entity, Dow DuPont, became the largest chemical company in the world, with a combined revenue of $86 billion. This merger was hailed as a triumph of strategic vision, but in reality, it was a capitulation. It was the solution that Third Point had demanded. The merger was not an end. It was a means to an end. The entire purpose of the merger was to create a company so large that it could be efficiently and profitably dismantled. And that is exactly what happened. Just 2 years later, in 2019, the Dow DuPont entity was officially broken apart. It was split into 3 new specialized companies: DuPont, Specialty Materials; Corteva, the agricultural business, including the Agent Orange legacy; and a new company that would inherit the core commodity chemical business. The name they gave this new company? Dow Incorporated. The dissolution was complete. The company that Herbert Dow had built, the massive integrated conglomerate that had supplied wars and revolutionized the American kitchen, was gone. It had been dismantled not by protesters, but by its own shareholders, by the very capitalist logic of profit that it had championed. The new Dow Inc., which emerged in 2019, was a ghost. It was a $45 billion company, but it was a shadow of the integrated colossus Herbert Dow had built. The original Dow Chemical, the company that had produced both the Saran wrap for the kitchen and the Agent Orange for the jungle, was dead. It was a moment that changed English history. The crowd, perhaps amused by Flower Dew's audacity and happy to take his money, agreed. They left his half-ruined enclosures and marched with renewed purpose towards the property of Robert Kett. One can only imagine the scene. Robert Kett, a man of substance and order, standing outside his home, watching as a volatile mob of several hundred angry, shouting men approaches his land. They have been sent by his personal rival, and they intend to destroy his property. Every instinct of his class and background would have told him to defend what was his. He could have barricaded his doors, armed his servants and farmhands, and stood his ground as a man of law and order, as John Flower Dew had expected. That was the safe choice, the respectable choice. That was what any man of his standing was supposed to do. But Robert Kett did something that no one, least of all Flower Dew, or any of the gentlemen of Norfolk, could have possibly predicted. He did not confront them with threats or violence. He did not order them off his land. Instead, he listened. He walked out to meet the leaders of the crowd and engaged them in conversation. He heard their grievances, not just about his own fences, which they had been paid to destroy, but about all the enclosures, the high rents, the stolen commons, the arrogance of men like Flower Dew, and the powerlessness of the poor. He seemingly recognized that their anger was not simply drunken vandalism, but perhaps the raw, authentic cry of a people who had been pushed to the very edge of survival and could be pushed no further. And in that moment, standing in his fields with an angry mob before him, Robert Kett made a decision that would not only seal his own fate, but would set his entire county ablaze. He looked at the crowd of his neighbors and fellow countrymen, and he saw not a threat, but a just cause. He told them that they were right. He agreed that the enclosures were a cancer on the Commonwealth and a crime against the poor. Then, in an act of solidarity that still has the power to astonish, he went one step further. He declared that he would not only welcome them to tear down his own fences, but that he would personally help them to do it. And then came the fateful words. He announced that he would stand with them, and if they needed a leader to guide their just cause, he would be that leader. The crowd, which had come to tear down his hedges, had found a captain instead. The local riot was about to become a full-blown rebellion. The transformation was instantaneous and electric. The air, thick moments before, with the volatile energy of a mob bent on destruction, was now charged with something entirely new: astonishment, then dawning hope, and finally a deafening roar of approval. For the men who had marched on Robert Kett's property, their anger was a familiar festering wound, a constant companion in their daily lives. They knew the bitterness of injustice, the sting of contempt, the gnawing anxiety of poverty. What they did not know, what they had never experienced, was a man of property and standing, looking them in the eye and declaring that their cause was his own. It was a moment that defied the rigid, God-given order of their world. A gentleman did not side with the peasantry against his own class. It was unthinkable, yet here it was happening. Robert Kett, the tanner and landowner, had crossed a social chasm with a few simple words, and in doing so, he had transformed a local riot into an organized and righteous rebellion. His brother William, a butcher from Wymantum, stood at his side. Possessing the same sturdy yeoman spirit, he did not hesitate. Where Robert went, he would follow. This immediate familial solidarity gave the nascent movement a solid core of leadership. It was not just one man's impulsive decision. It was the deliberate choice of a respected local family. The crowd, which had come to Kett's land as a disorganized rabble paid by his enemy, now looked to him as their captain. His first act as their leader was a masterstroke of symbolic power. He did not simply permit them to tear down his fences. He picked up an axe and struck the first blow himself. The sound of his axe biting into the wooden rails of his own enclosure was the true birth cry of the rebellion. It was a declaration that the old rules no longer applied. One by one, his own hedges and fences were torn down, dismantled not with rage, but with a kind of solemn purpose, and piled up to be burned in a great bonfire that lit up the Norfolk sky. Their next objective was clear and unanimously acclaimed. With Kett at their head, the newly galvanized force, its numbers already swelling as news of the incredible events spread to neighboring farms, marched back to the estate of John Flowerdew. There was a grim and satisfying irony in their return. Flowerdew, who had tried to use this popular anger as a weapon against his rival, now found it turned back on him, magnified and legitimized by that very rival's leadership. This time, the destruction was not a brief, chaotic outburst. It was methodical, systematic, and complete. Every fence, every hedge, every barrier that Flowerdew had erected to seal off the common lands was torn down, uprooted, and destroyed. It was a physical manifestation of their demands, an undoing of the gentry's work of greed. Yet even in this act of retribution, Kett imposed a discipline that was crucial to his leadership. He forbade looting of Flowerdew's house and any violence against his family or servants. Their quarrel, he insisted, was with the enclosures, not with the man, however much they despised him. This was to be a campaign for justice, not a spree of chaotic vengeance. The news of these events spread like wildfire through the tinder, dry countryside of Norfolk. In an age without newspapers or formal communication, news traveled at the speed of a galloping horse or a fast-walking man. Messengers, dispatched by Kett and his lieutenants, rode out from Wymondham, carrying the astonishing tale to the market towns and villages across the county. The story was repeated with growing excitement in taverns, in churchyards, after Sunday service, and over field boundaries. A landowner, Robert Kett, had taken up the Commons' cause. He was leading an army to demand justice. They were tearing down the hedges. For thousands of people who had felt powerless and ignored for years. This was a call to arms they could not resist. From across Norfolk, and even from neighboring Suffolk, men left their fields and workshops to join him. Tenant farmers whose rents had become unbearable, weavers whose livelihoods were threatened by the collapse of the local economy, artisans from the towns who felt the pinch of inflation, and even some parish priests who believed the rapaciousness of the gentry was an affront to Christian teaching. They all flocked to Kett's banner. What had been a mob of a few hundred quickly swelled into a disciplined column of thousands. It was a diverse coalition, united by a shared sense of economic grievance. This was not simply a revolt of the destitute. It included many, like Kett himself, from the middling sort, who felt that the Commonwealth was being corrupted by a small elite of fabulously wealthy landowners. Their decision to march was a monumental one for every individual who made it. It meant leaving their homes, their wives and children, and their half-tended fields at the height of summer, just weeks before the vital harvest. It meant branding themselves as rebels and risking the terrible penalty for treason. It was a testament to the depth of their desperation that so many were willing to take such an enormous gamble. Kett realized that this growing movement needed a focal point, a clear and ambitious objective that went beyond tearing down local fences. Petty revenge on men like Flowerdew would achieve nothing in the long run. To make the government in London listen, they had to make a statement that could not be ignored. He made the audacious decision to march his growing army on Norwich, the second largest and most powerful city in England after London. Norwich was the administrative heart of East Anglia, the seat of the local gentry's power, and a symbol of the established order. To capture it would be a revolutionary act. The rebel army that marched towards Norwich in mid-July was not the chaotic rabble that the gentry would later portray. Under Robert Kett's command, it became a surprisingly disciplined and organized force. He organized the men into companies, often based on the villages or hundreds they came from, with appointed captains. They marched in some semblance of order, and Kett strictly enforced his ban on looting from the farms and manors they passed. Their quarrel was with the system, and he knew that terrorizing the general populace would rob them of the moral high ground they claimed. He was determined to show that they were not a destructive mob, but the agents of a new and better form of justice. Upon reaching the outskirts of the great walled city, Kett chose his headquarters with strategic brilliance. He led his army to Mousehold Heath, a large, elevated expanse of gorse and heathland on a hill overlooking Norwich from the northeast, just across the River Wensum. The location was perfect. It provided a clear view of the entire city, allowing them to monitor any movements of troops. The high ground was naturally defensible, and the wide open space was large enough to accommodate the vast number of people flocking to join them, a number estimated to have eventually swelled to as many as 16,000 men, women, and children. But Mousehold Heath became much more than just a military encampment. Under Kett's visionary leadership, it transformed into a remarkably organized and functioning center for the rebellion, a vast, bustling encampment operating under its own administration. This camp was the heart and soul of the rebellion, and it was here that Kett's true vision for a reformed commonwealth began to take concrete shape. He was absolutely determined to demonstrate that their movement was not about descending into anarchy, but about establishing a better, fairer, and more honest form of government. The physical and spiritual centerpiece of the vast camp was a large, ancient oak tree, which quickly became known throughout the kingdom as the Oak of Reformation. Beneath its spreading branches, Kett established a court of justice. This was not a mock court for show trials, but a serious attempt to administer the law as they believed it should be. Kett himself presided, but not as a dictator. He sat with a council of governors, carefully chosen representatives from the various hundreds or districts of Norfolk and Suffolk from which the rebels had come. This created a rudimentary parliament, a representative body to give voice to the diverse communities that made up their army. Here, beneath the oak tree, they held open-air court sessions. They heard grievances from the common people, who for the first time in their lives could speak of their troubles to a panel of their peers and expect a fair hearing. The court's primary business, however, was to put captured members of the local gentry on trial. These men were hunted down and brought to the camp not to be summarily executed, but to answer for their crimes. It is crucial to understand that they were not put on trial simply for being gentlemen. They were tried for specific documented acts of cruelty, corruption, and above all, illegal enclosure. The rebels kept meticulous records, gathering evidence and testimony from villagers who had suffered under these men for years. Those found guilty were not hanged or tortured, as they might have been in a less disciplined uprising. Instead, they were held prisoner within the camp, a powerful symbol of the world turned upside down, where the powerful were now being held accountable by the powerless. Kett was proving a profound point, that justice could be fair, swift, and administered by ordinary people. He was contrasting his open-air court held in full view of the community with the corrupt, secretive, and biased local courts of the gentry, which almost always sided with the rich. The organization of the camp at Mousehold Heath was a marvel of improvisation and communal effort. Feeding a city of 16,000 people was a monumental logistical challenge. The rebels established a sophisticated system for requisitioning food and supplies from the surrounding countryside. Foraging parties were sent out with strict orders from Kett. They were not to loot indiscriminately. Instead, they were to take what was needed: cattle, sheep, grain, and beer, primarily from the estates of the gentry, who were known to be harsh landlords or enclosers. Crucially, they issued receipts for everything they took, signed in the name of the king's great camp, with promises of future payment once their grievances were redressed by the government. They saw themselves as the king's loyal subjects, temporarily commandeering resources to right the wrongs that the king's corrupt local officials had allowed to fester. They were not thieves. In their own eyes, they were building and supplying a new temporary commonwealth. They even established their own spiritual leadership. A local clergyman sympathetic to their cause, Thomas Conyers, was appointed as the camp's chaplain. He conducted daily services under the Oak of Reformation, and significantly, he used the New English Book of Common Prayer. This was a deliberate and shrewd political move. It demonstrated to the government in London that their rebellion was not a Catholic uprising like the one raging in the West Country. Their quarrel was not with the king's new Protestant faith. In fact, they embraced it. Their anger was directed squarely at the social and economic order. They believed the greed of the landowning class was fundamentally unchristian, and they saw their own movement as an attempt to create a more truly godly and charitable society, in line with the sermons they were now hearing in their own language. From this extraordinary position of strength, camped in their thousands overlooking Norwich, Kett and his council of governors drafted their formal demands. This document, known as the 29 Articles, is one of the most remarkable political manifestos of the Tudor age because it gives us a clear and articulate window into the minds of the rebels. This was not a simple, desperate plea for bread. It was a sophisticated and surprisingly radical program for social and economic reform. The articles, which they intended to send to the Lord Protector Somerset in London, went far beyond the single issue of enclosure. They began, of course, with the land. The first and most famous article demanded that from henceforth no man shall enclose any more. But they went further, demanding that all illegally enclosed saffron fields, a lucrative local crop, be returned to common usage. They called for rents to be immediately reduced to the levels they were at during the reign of King Henry VII decades earlier, before the great inflation had taken hold. They demanded an end to the web of feudal obligations that landlords still use to extract labor and fees from their tenants, insisting that all bondmen may be made free, for God made all free with his precious blood shedding. This was a revolutionary call for the abolition of the last vestiges of serfdom in England. Their demands extended to the reform of government and the church. They insisted that priests should be resident in their parishes and diligently teach the catechism to the poor, rather than being absentees who simply collected the parish income. They attacked the corruption of the church hierarchy, demanding that church officials who were too wealthy to perform their spiritual duties should have their land seized and used for the benefit of the local community. And in one of their most radical and forward-looking articles, they demanded that the common people should have a say in the appointment of local government officials, who were currently chosen by the very gentry they were protesting against. "We pray," they wrote, "that all feodaries, a type of royal official, and let them be chosen by the commons, that shall take any of the king's lands in farm, be chosen by the suffrages of the common people in their several hundreds." This was a demand for a measure of local democracy that was centuries ahead of its time. Throughout the document, the rebels were careful to profess their loyalty to the crown. Their slogan was "God Save the King." They saw themselves not as traitors trying to overthrow the king, but as loyal subjects who were rising up to save the young King Edward from his corrupt and greedy advisors and the rapacious local gentry who abused his authority. They addressed their petition to the good Duke of Somerset, genuinely believing that he was their ally, and that if he only knew the true extent of their suffering, he would intervene on their behalf. It was a plea for the central government to listen to them, to save them from the tyranny of local power. While the camp was organizing itself and drafting its manifesto, the city of Norwich was plunged into a state of crisis. The mayor, a respected merchant named Thomas Codd, and the city's aldermen were trapped in an impossible position. On the one hand, they had a duty to the crown to maintain order and resist the rebellion. On the other, they were faced with a disciplined army of 16,000 armed men camped on the hill above them, and many of the poorer citizens within the city walls were deeply sympathetic to the rebels' cause. They initially tried to play for time, entering into negotiations with Kett. They offered the rebels food and money if they would disperse, but they refused Kett's key demand to allow his army free passage through the city, which he needed for his supply lines. When negotiations broke down, Kett's army prepared to attack. Their artillery was weak, consisting of only a few captured small cannons, but their numbers were overwhelming. They swarmed towards the city walls, launching a fierce assault. The city's defenders put up a brave fight, but they were hopelessly outnumbered. The rebels eventually broke through the defenses, and after a sharp, bloody fight in the streets, Norwich fell into their hands. It was a stunning victory. Yet again, Kett showed remarkable restraint and a firm hand on his followers. There was no general massacre of the city's wealthy citizens, and no widespread looting was permitted. He immediately established his authority over the city, working with some of the existing administration. He even took the mayor, Thomas Codd, captive, but treated him with courtesy and respect, forcing him to sit as part of the governing council at the Oak of Reformation. Kett was now the master of England's second city. He had created his own government, his own court, and now he had captured the regional capital. News of the fall of Norwich sent shock waves through the government in London. Their first response, however, was surprisingly weak and demonstrated a fundamental underestimation of the scale and organization of the rebellion. They dispatched a royal herald who arrived at Mousehold Heath in late July. He was sent to offer a general pardon to all who would immediately lay down their arms, disperse, and go home peacefully. It was a classic Tudor tactic of stick and carrot, offer mercy to the rank and file to peel them away from their leaders. The pardon, however, explicitly excluded the ringleader, Robert Kett. The scene that followed, played out before the assembled thousands at the Oak of Reformation, was one of the most dramatic moments of the entire rebellion. The royal herald, in his magnificent tabard, read out the king's proclamation of pardon. For a moment, the entire rebellion hung in the balance. The offer was tempting. These were farmers, not soldiers. The harvest was waiting, and their families were at home, unprotected. The king was offering them a way out, a return to normality with no repercussions. But then Robert Kett stepped forward. In a clear, defiant voice that rang out across the heath, he gave a reply recorded memorably, though perhaps dramatized, by later chroniclers like Holinshed. Kings and princes, he reportedly declared, are wont to pardon wicked persons, not innocent and just men. I trust I have done nothing that needs a pardon. He was rejecting the very premise of the offer. To accept a pardon was to admit guilt, and he believed their cause was entirely just. He turned to his followers and told them that he would not abandon them to save himself. He would stand with them, to live or to die. Inspired by his unwavering courage and loyalty, the crowd roared its approval. One after another, they shouted that they too would not accept a pardon, for they had done no wrong. They scornfully rejected the king's mercy. It was a moment of supreme defiance. They had crossed the Rubicon. By refusing a direct offer from the king's representative, they had collectively committed themselves to a path of open treason. There was no going back. The defiant refusal of the king's pardon, roared across Mousehold Heath by 16,000 throats, was an act of unprecedented audacity. When the royal herald returned to London, dusty and humiliated, his report sent shock waves of fury and alarm through the corridors of power at Whitehall. The Privy Council, already grappling with the simultaneous and bloody prayer book rebellion in the West Country, now faced the terrifying prospect of England's second city being firmly in the hands of a disciplined and well-led popular army. This was no longer a local riot about fences. It was a direct and humiliating challenge to the authority of the Tudor state. The rebels had not only rejected the king's mercy, but they had also, in Robert Kett's eloquent words, rejected the very notion that they had done anything wrong. This was an ideological challenge as much as a military one, and it could not be tolerated. The Duke of Somerset, the Lord Protector, found himself in a politically perilous position. His known sympathies for the Commons and his commissions against enclosure were now being used as a weapon against him by his rivals on the council. Men like the ambitious John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, argued behind closed doors that Somerset's soft, populist approach had fanned the flames of sedition. They claimed his weakness had encouraged the very chaos he was now unable to contain. Pressured to act decisively and prove he was no friend to traitors, Somerset and the council agreed that a military solution was now the only option. A force must be sent to crush the Norfolk rebels, retake Norwich, and make a brutal example of their leaders. The man chosen to lead this expedition was William Parr, the Marquis of Northampton. The choice was, in hindsight, a catastrophic one, revealing the profound arrogance and disconnect of the ruling elite. Northampton was the Queen Dowager Catherine Parr's brother, a man of impeccable courtly breeding, a patron of the arts, and a skilled musician. He was charming, educated, and a prominent figure in the royal court, but he was emphatically not a soldier. He possessed no significant military experience and was known more for his lavish lifestyle and marital scandals than for his tactical acumen. He viewed the Norfolk rebels not as a serious military force, but as an unruly rabble of peasants, a company of beasts, who would surely scatter in terror at the first sight of a royal army, led by a great nobleman. His appointment was a political one, intended to show that the highest ranks of the aristocracy were taking the matter in hand. Accompanying him was a coterie of other gentlemen and nobles, including the respected Lord Sheffield, all of whom shared Northampton's dismissive attitude. The army Northampton assembled was correspondingly small, numbering only around 1,400 to 1,500 men. The government's best troops were already committed to the war in Scotland, or tied down fighting the rebellion in the West. His force was a hastily gathered mix of local levies and the private retinues of the gentlemen who accompanied him. Critically, it also included a contingent of Italian mercenaries under the command of a soldier of fortune named Malatesta. These foreign troops, while professional, were a public relations disaster. The use of foreign soldiers to kill English subjects was deeply unpopular and fed directly into the rebels' narrative that they were the true Englishmen, defending the Commonwealth against a corrupt elite that would even hire foreigners to suppress its own people. Northampton and his small army marched from London to Cambridge and then on towards Norfolk, their banners flying, confident of a swift and easy victory. They arrived outside Norwich on the 30th of July. The city's gates were barred against them, but after some parley, the mayor and city authorities, eager to prove their loyalty, allowed them to enter. Northampton's force marched into Norwich and took up positions in the marketplace, the symbolic heart of the city. The Marquis, feeling secure within the city walls, promptly issued a proclamation demanding the rebels' surrender, and then, according to contemporary accounts, settled down for a leisurely dinner, treating the entire affair as if it were already concluded. This complacency was his first major error. He failed to secure the entire city, leaving several sections of the walls and some of the gates poorly defended, and he made little effort to understand the tactical situation or the nature of the enemy camped on the hill above him. From their vantage point on Mousehold Heath, Robert Kett and his council watched every move. They had seen Northampton's small army arrive and enter the city. They were not intimidated. On the contrary, their own numbers dwarfed the royal force, and their morale was sky high. Kett sent his own herald down to the city walls to parley with Northampton. The exchange was tense. Kett demanded to know if the Marquis had the authority to fulfill the promises of reform that had been hinted at by the government, or if he had merely come to offer the same pardon they had already rejected. Northampton, incensed at being addressed as an equal by a man he considered a traitorous tanner, replied with aristocratic fury, declaring that he had come not to bargain, but to command them, as rebels and traitors, to lay down their arms and beg for the king's mercy. The time for talking was over. That night, Kett launched his counterattack. He demonstrated a remarkable grasp of military tactics, exploiting Northampton's arrogance and the rebels' key advantages, superior numbers and intimate knowledge of the local terrain. The attack was two-pronged. A massive wave of rebels descended from Mousehold Heath and threw themselves against the city's eastern walls, creating a noisy and furious diversion. While Northampton's men were distracted by this assault, Kett's main force exploited the poorly guarded sections of the wall elsewhere, scaling them with ladders or breaking through weakly defended gates. Soon, thousands of rebels were pouring into the city. What followed was a brutal and terrifying night of street-to-street fighting. The narrow, winding, unlit medieval streets of Norwich became a death trap for Northampton's men. The rebels knew every alleyway, every courtyard, every choke point. They fired arrows from rooftops and windows. They set up ambushes in side streets, and they fought with a desperate ferocity that shocked the professional soldiers. Northampton's cavalry was rendered almost useless in the tight confines, and his Italian mercenaries, who fought with professional skill but little loyalty, began to take heavy casualties. The fighting was savage and personal, a confused melee of pike, sword, and agricultural tools transformed into deadly weapons. The climax of the battle came with the death of Lord Sheffield. He was a prominent nobleman, and finding himself unhorsed in the chaos, he reportedly removed his helmet to show his rank, hoping to be taken for ransom, as was the custom in warfare between gentlemen. But this was not a war between gentlemen. To the rebels, he was simply one of their oppressors. A rebel reputed to be a butcher named Folk mistook the gesture or ignored it and struck him a fatal blow with a club. The death of such a high-ranking nobleman sent a wave of panic through the royalist forces. They were not fighting a disorganized mob. They were fighting a determined and lethal army that did not play by the established rules of war. As dawn broke, the situation for the royal army was hopeless. They were surrounded, demoralized, and being systematically cut to pieces. The Italian mercenaries, seeing the battle was lost and having no desire to die for the Marquis, broke and fled. Their flight triggered a general collapse. The entire royal army was completely and utterly routed. The Marquis of Northampton, the great courtier who had come to teach the peasants a lesson, was forced to flee for his life in the most humiliating fashion imaginable, escaping the city with only a handful of his followers, leaving his baggage, his reputation in the city of Norwich behind him. The rebels had won an astonishing victory. They had not just repelled a royal force, they had destroyed it. They had retaken complete control of the city. The marketplace, where Northampton had dined so confidently the night before, was now littered with the bodies of his soldiers. For the men and women on Mousehold Heath, it must have seemed like a miracle, a clear sign of God's favor. They had faced the king's army and had triumphed. Their confidence surged to dizzying new heights. Robert Kett's authority was now absolute, his leadership vindicated in the most dramatic way possible. For a brief, glorious moment in the high summer of 1549, it must have seemed to the farmer from Norfolk or the weaver from Norwich that they could not lose, that their new commonwealth founded on justice and equity might actually prevail. But their stunning victory had also signed their death warrant. The news of Northampton's humiliating defeat threw the government in London into a full-blown panic. This was now a crisis of the first order. The rebels had not only defied the king, but they had defeated his army in open battle and killed one of his most prominent nobles. The authority of the Tudor state was on the verge of collapse. There could be no more half measures, no more small armies led by incompetent courtiers. The response had to be overwhelming, brutal, and final. The political fallout for the Duke of Somerset was immediate and severe. His rival, the Earl of Warwick, seized the moment. He publicly and scathingly condemned Somerset's handling of the crisis, arguing that his vacillating policies and perceived sympathy for the rebels had led directly to this disaster. The council was now convinced. They turned away from Somerset and looked for a man who could get the job done, a man who would not fail. And there was only one obvious candidate. They turned to John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick. Warwick was everything the Marquis of Northampton was not. He was the most experienced, ruthless, and effective soldier in the kingdom. The son of Henry VII's hated tax collector, Dudley had clawed his way to the top through sheer ability and ambition. He had a distinguished military career with successful campaigns in Scotland and France. He was a shrewd tactician, a strict disciplinarian, and a man utterly devoid of the sentimentality that afflicted Somerset. He saw the rebellion not as a social problem to be managed, but as a cancer to be cut out with fire and sword. Warwick was given a clear mandate: to crush the rebellion by any means necessary. He set about assembling a new army, and this time there would be no mistakes. The force was far larger, estimated at over 12,000 men. It included a corps of battle-hardened English veterans recalled from the Scottish garrisons. It had a powerful artillery train and a large contingent of cavalry. And, most ominously, Warwick secured the services of 1,200 German Landsknechte, heavily armed and armored professional mercenaries who were widely considered the most formidable infantry in Europe. Unlike Northampton's Italians, these were elite battle-proven troops who would not be easily panicked. The government was taking no more chances. The full, merciless weight of the Tudor military machine was now being mobilized. As Warwick and his professional army began their long, deliberate march north towards Norfolk, a sense of foreboding must have begun to creep into the rebel camp, despite their recent triumph. They had won a battle, but they were about to face a war against a man who did not know defeat. The glorious summer of the Oak of Reformation was drawing to a close. The brief glimpse of a world turned upside down, a world where the last could be first, was about to be extinguished. The final bloody act of the tragedy was about to begin. The victory over Northampton, the rebels' finest hour, had made their total destruction an absolute certainty. The human cost of any rebellion is not measured in grand political statements or the strategies of generals, but in the accumulation of individual lives torn apart, of families fractured, and of quiet personal hopes sacrificed for a collective dream. For Robert Kett, the single momentous decision made at his farmstead in Wymondham was not an abstract political calculation. It was a profound and irreversible personal transformation. He was a man approaching 60, an age in the 16th century when most looked towards a quiet conclusion to their lives, a time for securing their legacy for their children and grandchildren. He was a man of substance, accustomed to the respect of his community and the security of property. Yet, in a single afternoon, he had cast all of it aside to embark on a path of incredible danger and utter uncertainty. What truly drove him? The historical record, written almost exclusively by the victors, who were determined to portray him as a villainous traitor, is largely silent on his inner thoughts and motivations. He left no diaries, no personal letters that survive the wreckage of his cause. But we can piece together a portrait of the man from his actions, and those actions speak with a volume that transcends the biased chronicles of his enemies. His repeated refusal to accept a pardon, especially the first one, which would have guaranteed his own life while leaving his followers to their fate, is perhaps the most revealing moment of all. It was an act of supreme self-sacrifice. He could have saved his own skin, walked away, and allowed the rebellion to dissolve, arguing that he had made his point. Instead, he chose to bind his own fate inextricably to that of the thousands of desperate people who had placed their trust in him. This was not the action of a self-serving demagogue whipping up a mob for his own ambition. It was the solemn act of a man bound by a powerful, almost archaic sense of duty and honor. He had given these people his word, and he would not break it, even with the executioner's axe and the traitor's horrific death hanging over his head. In the weeks spent on Mousehold Heath, presiding over the Oak of Reformation, he must have felt the immense crushing weight of 16,000 lives resting on his shoulders. Every decision, every negotiation, every strategic choice carried the potential for their collective salvation or their mass slaughter. The sleepless nights, the constant anxiety, the burden of leadership must have been immense. Yet by all accounts, he bore it with a quiet dignity and an unwavering resolve that inspired a fierce and profound loyalty in his followers. Adding another layer of deep personal tragedy to the story is his relationship with his brother, William. From the very beginning, when the mob first arrived at Robert's farm, William stood by his side. He was a constant presence throughout the rebellion, a co-leader, a confidant, a brother not just in blood, but in a shared, unshakable conviction. They were in this together, for better or for worse. They would share the brief triumphs of Mousehold, the heady days of their victory over Northampton, but they were also destined to share the same brutal fate. The historical image of the two brothers, executed on the same day but separated in death, one hanged from the walls of Norwich Castle, the other from the steeple of their own Wymondham Church, is a heartbreaking testament to their shared commitment. Their joint sacrifice elevates the story from a political dispute into a family tragedy of epic proportions. We must also try to imagine the emotional world of the ordinary rebel, the anonymous farmer or artisan who formed the backbone of Kett's army. Consider a man, a husband and a father from a small Norfolk village. For years, he has watched his family grow hungrier and more desperate. He has witnessed the common land where his children played and his single cow grazed, the very land that represented the difference between subsistence and starvation, be fenced off by a local gentleman who already owned more land than he could ever need. He has felt the sharp sting of humiliation in the local manorial courts, where his legitimate complaints are dismissed with contempt by magistrates who are the friends and kinsmen of the very man who has wronged him. He has seen the value of the few pennies he earns shrink with every passing month due to the king's debased currency. His world is shrinking, his future is bleak, and a cold, hard knot of resentment has settled deep in his gut. Then one day a rider comes to his village with astonishing news. A camp has been formed at Mousehold Heath, thousands strong. They are led not by some wild-eyed fanatic, but by a respectable landowner, Robert Kett, a man just like the ones who have oppressed him, but who has seen the injustice and taken the side of the people. They have a court of justice under an oak tree. They have drafted a list of demands. They have captured the city of Norwich. Making the choice to join them would have been terrifying. It meant taking the rusty billhook from the barn wall, kissing his wife and children goodbye, and telling them he might not return. It meant abandoning his fields just before the harvest, risking not only his own life but the starvation of his family if he failed. It meant knowingly committing an act of high treason, the most heinous crime in the Tudor world. The fact that so many thousands made this terrifying choice speaks to the utter desperation of their situation. Yet life in the camp must have been an extraordinary transformative experience for these men. For the first time in their lives, they were part of something bigger than themselves. They were no longer powerless individuals, isolated in their misery. They were a community, a brotherhood, with a shared and noble purpose. They rose in the morning not to toil for a master who despised them, but to work for their new commonwealth. They participated in drills. They stood guard on the ramparts they built. They listened to fiery sermons from their chaplain. that spoke of God's justice for the poor, and they witnessed powerful, arrogant gentlemen being brought before their own court to answer for their crimes. It must have been intoxicating, a dizzying glimpse of a world turned upside down, a world where the last could finally be first. This powerful sense of community, purpose, and shared destiny explains why they followed Kett with such unwavering loyalty. It explains why they, too, rejected the king's pardon. They were no longer just fighting against the enclosures. They were fighting for the new world they had built on Mousehold Heath. Their rebellion had ceased to be a mere protest and had become a fight to defend their newfound dignity. It was a desperate, courageous, and profoundly human attempt to reclaim a sense of worth and agency that had been systematically stripped away from them by an economic and social system that viewed them as disposable. As the Earl of Warwick's professional army marched ever closer, the men at the Oak of Reformation were not just defending a military position. They were defending the most precious and meaningful experience of their entire lives. When John Dudley, the Earl of Warwick, arrived outside Norwich in the final days of August 1549, the character of the conflict changed irrevocably. The air of festival, of righteous triumph that had sustained the rebel camp since their victory over Northampton evaporated, replaced by a cold professional dread. Warwick was not a preening courtier. He was a hardened soldier, a pragmatist forged in the brutal campaigns of Scotland and France, and he exuded an aura of grim competence. He was a man who understood violence not as an expression of anger, but as a tool of statecraft, to be applied with precision and overwhelming force. His army was a reflection of his own ruthless efficiency. It was a terrifying spectacle for the farmers and artisans watching from the heights of Mousehold Heath. Numbering over 12,000 men, it was a composite force of the deadliest elements in the Tudor military arsenal. There were companies of English longbowmen, still a formidable weapon, and ranks of billmen, their traditional polearms glinting in the late summer sun. There was a powerful contingent of cavalry, including the gentlemen pensioners, the king's own elite bodyguard, clad in the finest steel armor. Most terrifying of all were the foreign mercenaries. Warwick had brought with him not only a unit of Italian arquebusiers, skilled in the use of firearms, but also a large contingent of German Landsknechte. These were the most feared professional infantry in Europe, renowned for their discipline, their ferocity, and their mastery of the pike. Clad in their distinctive slashed and puffed clothing, they were a vibrant but deadly vision, a clear statement from the government in London that the time for games was over. Warwick's first move was a calculated piece of psychological warfare. Following standard procedure, he sent a herald to the rebel camp on August 23rd to offer a final pardon to all who would lay down their arms. Once again, the pardon explicitly excluded Robert Kett and the other ringleaders. It was a shrewd attempt to divide the movement, to offer the terrified rank and file one last chance to save themselves by abandoning their captains. But the bonds forged in the camp, the shared sense of purpose and the loyalty to Kett, were still too strong. The offer was rejected, though perhaps with less of the defiant bravado than before. The sight of Warwick's army arrayed in the fields below had concentrated the mind wonderfully. With the formalities concluded, Warwick began his systematic and methodical assault. He did not launch a foolish frontal attack on the rebels' strong defensive position on Mousehold Heath. Instead, he focused on retaking the city of Norwich. His professional troops, led by the German mercenaries, fought their way into the city, battling through the same narrow streets where Northampton's men had been slaughtered. This time, however, the outcome was different. The rebels fought with desperate courage, turning every house into a fortress and every street corner into a barricade. But courage alone could not stand against disciplined soldiers, superior armor, and firearms. Slowly, bloodily, street by street, Warwick's men drove the rebels out of the city, pushing them back across the river to their last sanctuary on the heath. Kett's forces were now trapped. Their position on Mousehold was still strong, a natural fortress that would be costly to assault. But Warwick was a patient commander. He established a tight blockade around the hill, cutting off all of the rebels' supply lines. For weeks, the great camp had sustained itself by foraging across the Norfolk countryside. Now that lifeline was severed. The mood in the camp, once so optimistic and full of revolutionary fervor, began to curdle into desperation. Food supplies, already strained by the vast number of people, began to run critically low. The summer was ending, and the nights were growing colder and wetter. Disease, the inevitable companion of any large encampment, began to spread. The elation of their earlier victories gave way to the gnawing realities of hunger, fear, and the slow grinding pressure of a professional siege. The new Commonwealth was starving. It was in this atmosphere of desperation and decaying morale that a fatal mistake was made, a decision that has puzzled historians for centuries. A local prophecy, possibly circulating at the time or attributed later by folklore, began to gain currency among the beleaguered rebels. This rhyming couplet was interpreted as foretelling their ultimate victory in a strangely specific verse. The country Noffs, Hob, Dick, and Hick, with clubs and clouded shoon, shall fill the vale of Dussindale with slaughtered bodies soon. In the fevered, anxious minds of the rebels, the meaning was clear. Noffs was a local derogatory term for country bumpkins or clowns. It was how the gentry referred to them. Hob, Dick, and Hick were common peasant names. Clouded shoon referred to their rustic, hobnailed shoes. The prophecy, as they chose to interpret it, was a divine promise that they, the common folk, would fill the nearby valley of Dussindale with the slaughtered bodies of their enemies. It was a sign from God, a promise that if they moved the battle to that specific location, they would be granted a miraculous victory. Historians have long debated the true reason for the rebels' final catastrophic move. Was it a genuine mass delusion, a desperate clutching at the straws of superstition by a starving and terrified army? Or was it a calculated but incredibly risky gamble by Robert Kett himself? He was a pragmatic man, not a fool. He must have known that his army could not survive a prolonged siege on Mousehold Heath. Their morale was cracking and their supplies were gone. A desperate breakout attempt or a pitched battle, however slim the odds, might have seemed like a better option than slowly starving to death. Perhaps he saw the prophecy not as a divine command, but as a useful tool to rally his flagging troops, to inspire them with the courage for one last all-or-nothing assault. Whatever the reason, faith in a foolish prophecy, a commander's desperate gamble, or a combination of both, the decision was made. On the 27th of August, the rebel army did the unthinkable. They abandoned their fortified position on the high ground of Mousehold Heath. They relinquished every tactical advantage they possessed and marched down into the flat, open valley of Dussindale to face Warwick's professional army on a field of his choosing. It was a catastrophic tactical error, a move so disastrous that it seems almost suicidal in retrospect. In the open field, their greatest asset, their sheer numbers, was negated. They were willingly moving into a perfect killing ground, a place where Warwick's superior cavalry and disciplined infantry could operate with maximum lethal effect. Warwick could scarcely believe his luck. As the rebel army, perhaps 12,000 strong, poured down from the hills and began to form a makeshift battle line in the valley, He calmly and professionally prepared his troops for the slaughter. The rebels, to their credit, did not simply charge in a chaotic mob. They dug a defensive trench and fortified their position with carts and stakes, a testament to the organizational skills they had learned over the summer. But it was a pitiful defense against what was to come. The battle was a massacre. Warwick's artillery opened fire, tearing bloody holes in the densely packed ranks of the rebel army. Then he unleashed his cavalry. The gentlemen pensioners, the finest heavy horsemen in England, charged their flanks, crashing into the lines of poorly armed farmers with terrifying force. The rebels' makeshift weapons, their scythes, billhooks, and pitchforks, were no match for armored knights on war horses. The flanks crumbled, and panic began to set in. Then came the final decisive blow. Warwick ordered his infantry to advance, with the German Landsknechte forming the vanguard. They advanced across the valley floor like a relentless machine of death, a solid wall of pikes and steel. The rebels fought with the ferocious courage of doomed men. They stood their ground and died in their thousands. But their courage was not enough. The professional mercenaries cut through their lines, their long pikes keeping the rebels at a distance while the arquebusiers fired volleys into their ranks. The battle degenerated into a one-sided butchery. The prophecy came true, but in the most horrific and ironic way imaginable. The Vale of Dussendale was indeed filled with slaughtered bodies, but they were the bodies of the rebels. In a single brutal afternoon of bloodshed, somewhere between 2,000 and 4,000 of Kett's followers were cut down. The rebellion was not just broken, it was annihilated. Robert Kett, watching the disaster unfold from a vantage point, saw that everything was lost. The dream of the Oak of Reformation, the new Commonwealth, his entire world. It was all being destroyed in a storm of steel before his very eyes. His nerve, which had held so strong for so many weeks, finally broke. He spurred his horse and fled the battlefield. It was not an act of cowardice so much as the simple human reaction of a man witnessing a cataclysm he had unleashed. He was captured the next day, hiding in a barn a few miles away, reportedly broken in spirit. His brother William was also captured in a separate incident. The dream was over, drowned in blood. The aftermath was one of brutal repression. Warwick's men gave no quarter during the battle, and in the days that followed, summary justice was dispensed across the Norfolk countryside. Warwick intended to execute vast numbers of the captured rebels. Warwick initially intended widespread executions, but ultimately showed a degree of pragmatic clemency. Perhaps, as some historians suggest, persuaded that a wholesale slaughter would leave the local gentry with no labor force for the harvest. Even in its mercy, the state was motivated by economics. Still, at least 300 rebels were hanged in the following days. Gibbets were erected across the county, and the bodies were left to rot in public as a stark and terrifying warning against any future defiance. The Oak of Reformation itself was cut down and burned. Robert and William Kett were considered too important to be dealt with by a simple field execution. They were shackled and taken in disgrace to the Tower of London. There they were put on trial for high treason. The verdict was, of course, a foregone conclusion. They were found guilty, and the sentence was the most horrific punishment the law could devise: to be hanged, drawn, and quartered. However, the sentence was partially commuted. They would be spared the full butchery of disembowelment and being cut into pieces. Instead, their deaths were to be carefully stage managed as the ultimate public spectacle of state power. In November, they were dragged from their cells in the Tower and taken back to Norfolk, the scene of their brief glory and their ultimate failure. On December 7th, 1549, the final act was carried out. William Kett was taken to the great steeple of Wymondham Abbey, the very church his community had fought to preserve, and was hanged in chains from its heights, a terrible warning to his own hometown. On the same day, Robert Kett was taken to the top of Norwich Castle. He was placed in a gibbet and hoisted out over the castle walls to hang there in agony until he died, and then for his body to rot away in full view of the city he had tried to liberate. The man who had judged the gentry from his court under an oak tree was now judged by them, and his punishment was meticulously designed to extinguish not just his life but his memory and the very idea he had fought for. For centuries, the official narrative, the one sanctioned and promoted by the state, was brutally simple and brutally effective. The story ended where it began, with the body of a traitor hanging from a castle wall. Kett's rebellion was remembered, if it was remembered at all, as a dark and cautionary tale of chaos, a terrifying example of what happens when the natural, God-given social order is challenged. The Tudor state and the historians who served its interests meticulously crafted a portrait of Robert Kett as a misguided, arrogant, and dangerous traitor who had foolishly unleashed the destructive fury of the mob. He was cast as the villain, a man whose ambition and pride had led thousands of his simple-minded followers to their deaths and brought a loyal and prosperous county to the brink of ruin. His name for generations became a byword for sedition, a ghost to be summoned whenever the ruling class needed to frighten its subjects into obedience. This interpretation was not merely a matter of historical opinion. It was a vital tool of state control. A story about a landowner who sided with the poor, who established a popular court of justice, and who articulated a sophisticated program of social reform was a dangerous story to tell. It might give people ideas. It might suggest that the injustices they suffered were not inevitable, that the established order was not infallible, and that resistance, however doomed, was possible. And so, the memory of the Oak of Reformation and the Commonwealth on Mousehold Heath had to be actively suppressed, buried under a mountain of official condemnation. The rotting bodies left hanging on gibbets across Norfolk were the first and most visceral part of this campaign of erasure, but the ink of the chroniclers and the sermons of the state-approved clergy were its long-term enforcement. The historical debate that has swirled around the rebellion ever since is complex and revealing. One of the central controversies revolves around the tragic figure of the Lord Protector, the Duke of Somerset. Was he, as his enemies claimed with venomous certainty, a socialist avant la lettre, a naive idealist whose public sympathy for the poor actively encouraged the rebellions of 1549? There is no doubt that his rhetoric and his actions gave the common people the distinct impression that the government was on their side. His commissions against enclosure, though ultimately toothless, and his public condemnations of greedy landlords had created a revolution of rising expectations. When the rebels at Mousehold Heath painstakingly drafted their petition, they addressed it directly to Somerset, believing him to be their champion in London, the good Duke who would surely listen to their plight. In reality, Somerset was a pragmatist caught in an impossible political bind, trapped between the legitimate demands of the increasingly desperate poor and the entrenched, implacable power of the landed gentry and aristocracy, who were the very source of his own power. He was a man who wanted to treat the disease of poverty with a poultice when his fellow nobles believed the only cure was the surgeon's knife. The great rebellions of 1549, both Kett's in the East and the Prayer Book Rebellion in the West, ultimately destroyed him. His great rival, the man who had brutally crushed the Norfolk rebels, the Earl of Warwick, used the chaos as the perfect excuse to stage a political coup. Returning to London in the autumn of 1549, Warwick was hailed as the savior of the realm. he skillfully painted Somerset as a weak and vacillating leader whose populist policies had led the country to the brink of total collapse. He argued that Somerset's failure to act decisively had allowed the rebellions to fester, costing thousands of lives and humiliating the crown. The other members of the Privy Council, terrified by the summer's events and eager to protect their own enclosed lands, readily agreed. In October 1549, Somerset was arrested, stripped of his title as Lord Protector, and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Although he was later released and briefly rejoined the council, his power was broken forever. The man who had tried, however feebly, to curb the boundless greed of the gentry was brought down, and the man who had filled the Vale of Dussindale with slaughtered bodies, John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, took his place, eventually becoming the Duke of Northumberland and the de facto ruler of England. Somerset was eventually rearrested on trumped-up charges of treason and executed in 1552. The fall of the good Duke sent a clear and chilling message. There would be no more sympathy for the Commons from the top. The hardliners were now in complete control. Another crucial area of historical debate is the very nature of the rebellion itself. Was it, like the simultaneous uprising in Cornwall and Devon, primarily a religious protest against the Protestant Reformation? The evidence suggests overwhelmingly that it was not. While the Western rebels marched under the banner of the Five Wounds of Christ and demanded the restoration of the Latin Mass and Catholic traditions, Kett's men embraced the new religion. Their appointed chaplain used the New English Book of Common Prayer for services at the Oak of Reformation, and their list of grievances contains no demands for a return to Catholicism. Their quarrel was not with the new church, but with the new economy. In a sense, they were radical Protestants who believed the Reformation had not gone far enough. They had seen the immense wealth of the monasteries seized by the crown only to be sold off to the very gentry who were now oppressing them. They believed that this wealth should have been used to fund education, establish orphanages, and help the poor, as Protestant reformers like Hugh Latimer had preached. When they looked at the greedy enclosing landlords, they saw men who were not behaving as true, charitable Christians should. Their rebellion was an economic and social one, but it was framed in a deeply moral and religious language. It was a demand for a truly godly commonwealth, not just a Protestant one. The ultimate tragedy of Kett's rebellion lies in the fact that it was not, at its heart, an attempt to destroy the Tudor state, but a desperate and creative attempt to engage with it. Kett and his followers were not anarchists bent on leveling all of society. The camp at Mousehold Heath, with its representative council, its court of justice, and its meticulously organized supply system, was a testament to their desire for order and good governance. The 29 articles they sent to London were not the ravings of a mad mob. They were a coherent and articulate plea for the central government to listen to them, to uphold its own laws, and to save them from the corruption and abuses of unaccountable local power. They failed because the state, in its moment of crisis, was not interested in listening. The Earl of Warwick did not march to Norwich to negotiate. He came to destroy. The response of the Tudor government to the cry of its people was not dialogue, but overwhelming, merciless, and spectacular violence. It was a clear and unambiguous message to the common people of England. You have no voice. Your concerns do not matter. And if you dare to demand justice, you will be met with German mercenaries, with cannon, and with steel. In the immediate aftermath, Kett's rebellion was a catastrophic and undeniable failure. Thousands were dead. A significant portion of Norfolk's male agricultural workforce wiped out. The enclosure movement was certainly not halted or reversed by the rebellion's failure. The brutal silencing of its opponents removed a significant obstacle, and the practice continued. The gentry were more firmly in control than ever before, their power cemented by the violence they had sanctioned. The brutal suppression of the revolt crushed the spirit of popular resistance in England for decades. The memory of Robert Kett was actively suppressed, his name erased from respectable history and associated only with the shame of treason. His body, and the bodies of his followers, were left to rot in public as an instrument of state terror, a constant reminder of the price of disobedience. For more than 300 years, this was where the story ended. Kett was a minor footnote in the history books, a failed traitor from a turbulent year, his cause dismissed and his character maligned. But history has a long and often subversive memory. In the 19th and 20th centuries, a period of immense social and political upheaval in Britain, the story of the Norfolk rebels began to be re-examined. With the rise of new political ideas about democracy, socialism, and social justice, people began to look at the events of 1549 in a completely new light. Radical historians, trade unionists, and socialist thinkers rediscovered Kett and his forgotten army. They saw him not as a traitor to his class, but as a hero who had transcended it. They looked at the 29 articles of the petition and saw not a list of treasonous demands, but a visionary blueprint for a more democratic and equitable society, a call for fair rents, the abolition of serfdom, and a say for ordinary people in their own governance. They saw the Oak of Reformation not as a seat of rebellion, but as a profound symbol of popular justice, a people's parliament that stood in stark contrast to the corrupt institutions of the elite. Robert Kett was slowly and painstakingly rehabilitated. He was recast as an early English hero, a martyr in the long, bloody struggle for the rights of the common person. In Norfolk, the county that had once disowned and executed him, he began to be celebrated. The process was slow, but by the 20th century, the transformation was complete. In 1949, on the 400th anniversary of the rebellion, a plaque was placed by the Norwich City Council near the site of the massacre at Dussindale, commemorating the men who died in the cause of social justice. Today, the city of Norwich is full of reminders of its most famous rebel leader. There is a Kett's Hill, a Robert Kett Jr. School, and even a pub, the Adam and Eve, which is said to have been used by Kett's men during the occupation of the city. The landowner who was executed as a traitor is now proudly honored as a local hero, a symbol of the enduring and often painful fight for a fairer world. We end where we began, with the body of a man hanging in chains from a castle wall. In the cold, calculating eyes of the Tudor state, this grotesque spectacle was the final, emphatic punctuation mark on a story of rebellion. An enemy had been defeated, order had been violently restored, a terrible lesson had been taught in blood and iron. This was the end. But they were wrong. By making Robert Kett a public monument to their power, they also inadvertently made him a martyr. By attempting to use his broken body to terrify the people into silence, they ensured he would never be entirely forgotten. By trying to erase his name from the pages of respectable history, they guaranteed that it would one day be rediscovered and remembered. Robert Kett failed in his own time. This is the bleak and unavoidable truth. He did not stop the enclosures. In the wake of his defeat, the process likely accelerated as the terrified peasantry were in no position to resist. He did not save his people from the greed of the powerful. He led thousands of them to their deaths in the valley of Dussindale. He died a lonely, horrific death, publicly branded a traitor to the kingdom he believed he was loyally serving. By any practical measure of success, his rebellion was an unmitigated disaster. but perhaps his true legacy was never meant to be measured in fields reclaimed or rents lowered. Perhaps it was forged in the simple yet profoundly radical idea that he and his followers brought to vibrant life for one brief, glorious summer under an old oak tree on a hill overlooking Norwich. It was the idea that justice is not a privilege to be dispensed by the rich, but a right that belongs to everyone. It was the idea that the complaints of the poor are not the whinings of a troublesome mob, but a legitimate grievance that deserves to be heard with respect. And it was the idea that one person's conscience, their moral conviction in the face of manifest injustice, can be a more powerful and transformative force than any army. Kett's grievances have not disappeared. The fundamental struggles that animated his rebellion echo down through the centuries and are still with us in different forms today. The conflict between the powerful and the powerless, the perennial debate over who controls the land and its resources, the cry for a system of justice that is not biased towards the wealthy and well-connected. These are timeless themes. The story of Robert Kett matters because it is a powerful reminder that the world we inhabit was not peacefully bequeathed to us. It was shaped by such struggles, by moments of violent confrontation where ordinary people dared to demand a better future. It is a bleak, tragic story of defeat, but it is also an inspiring one. It reminds us that even in the face of almost certain failure, there is a profound power and an inextinguishable dignity in standing up for what is right. Robert Kett was a flawed, ordinary man, a tanner, a landowner, a father, who found himself at the center of an extraordinary historical moment. He was faced with a choice that confronts people in every generation: to protect his own comfort and security, to mind his own business and look the other way, or to risk everything for the sake of his neighbors and his principles. He made his choice. In doing so, he lost his property, his reputation, and ultimately his life. But in that loss, he left behind something far more enduring, a story that nearly 500 years later still has the power to stir the conscience and remind us all of the high cost and the enduring importance of fighting for a better world.